Right in the cloud. Yes. Perfect. All right, I guess I should stand in the recording just to say. So anyways, we're going to kick off our international session first with Andy Seidl. Thank you, Andy. Take it away.
Thanks, Lee. So real quick, I'm Andy Seidl. I'm a professor in that building right over there, but I also serve as a senior technical advisor to the Biodiversity Finance Initiative. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that, as well as some of the other things that are going on worldwide. Thanks for being here, by the way, in the afternoon and the fourth day when you could have been at the ABS parade where my sons are. Sending videos. Yeah, so I uploaded a video, but not of the ABS, for your viewing pleasure. That actually does summarize some of the points that I'm going to talk about today. It happened to be presented just this morning to BioFin's board for the first time, so you'll have the second viewing. I checked it quickly to make sure that I'm not saying anything that runs counter to what's in there, and I think I'm okay. So if some of the numbers might be slightly different. Also, the pre-reading does a nice job of applying finance techniques to parks in post-COVID era. So if you're interested, please take a look. Okay. So BioFin, Biodiversity Finance Initiative, is United Nations Development Program project, began in 2012 with the remit to do a number of things. We recognize what the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity, and I'm going to say there is alphabet soup like nobody's business going on here, but that's the UN. So United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity, COP10, Conference of Parties, 10th one in Nagoya, realized that while people were asking for more money, they didn't really know where the money was going or how effective it was in its application to biodiversity conservation. So BioFin was started in the COP 11 in 2012 to try to get a handle on how much is being spent, what's being spent on, how effective are those expenditures, and how much do we need? And you've seen some of those, and then how do we get from here to there? How do we bridge that gap? And you've seen some of these applications all week long in the US context, and they are indeed applied in the developing world context with the additional dimension of it being in the developing world. So you see some other issues around institutions and rule of law, although this week I'm really not sure it's a developing country issue. And other dimensions, data availability, expertise, and things like that, that come into play. And so that's what we're about. We're in 41 countries now. Some of the green dots don't have names on them, but if you need to know what they are, I can let you know. Those are on our website, they're live. So you can see what's going on in each of those countries within BioFin by clicking on them. This initiative is supported by a lot of European nations. Belgium, EU, Flanders, which is an interesting one for most, France, Germany, Norway, Switzerland, Sweden, and the UK. We've had some additional interest from a few other donors, but at this point, this is who we got. And additional countries, as we're at 41 after 10 years, we're likely to go to 100 by 2030, given the dynamics of what's going on right now, and I'll explain a little bit about that later. What are we doing? Like I said, we don't know, there's no line for nature in your budget. And you've been addressing that this week a bit. No line for nature in the budget, no line for biodiversity. We don't know where it is in the national budget. As such, we had to develop a methodology that would help us to track it, then assess how much you've got, which then helps us understand what we need from a baseline of, we have the blue box, national and international finance that we know about, that we're actually currently spending. The trick in this methodology is that not all budgetary expenditures that you might tag for biodiversity are 100% for biodiversity or for nature. Often you say, okay, the whole park budget goes to nature. Fair enough. How about ag? How about organic agriculture? Is that is it intended to improve biodiversity condition? Some of it, not all of it. okay, so what should we do? Should we say it's 0? Should we say it's 1? This methodology allows us, as we've developed it, to either go deeper into the codes of the country to get to a point where we're comfortable saying it's 100%, or we make expert opinion judgment about what percentage of that expenditure is intended to improve biodiversity. So we've got a categorization system by code. We have an attribution system, which is a percentage, that then can be summed to get us to a what is currently being spent. We do that country by country. Each one's different, but we're starting to learn some things about how different countries go about investing in biodiversity. So we've got national and international finance. Then we need to estimate what we need. The most common document we would use for that would be the National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan, the NBSAP. With the post-2020 framework from the CBD coming up probably in the next year, there will still be NBSAPs. There was some discussion about how there would not be. It does appear that there will be, so we'll still be trying to map expenditures against the targets of the post-2020 framework. The pre-2020 framework had 20, the post-2020 framework will have 22, so it appears, at least as of yesterday. Could change, it does. And so what we need depends on what those targets say we need to do and what each country does with their NBSAP. So that's the orange bit. Now, that's current. Now, moving into the future, what do we do? You thought that was hard to begin with. Moving into the future, how much are we going to have is the track of the blue line, which could be up, down, or in between. How much are we going to need? We've purposefully put in a downward trajectory because we think there's probably some efficiencies that can be found, some prioritization that can be done, and some ways to make fewer mistakes than what we're currently making. So the graphic in the upper right is an estimate of the cost of subsidies harmful to biodiversity worldwide on an annual basis across all industries, about $1.8 trillion. So we can lessen our future load or our future need by being fiscally responsible and removing or reforming those 1.8 trillion in, the word used to be perverse subsidies, but some people don't like that. I kind of like it. It's one of the few fun words economists get to use. So that's how we visualize this. So that in addition to generating more income, more revenues. How do we get there? Well, the methodology has us do 4 different outputs. One gives us the context, the institutional context, particularly important in developing nation context, where we may have significant gaps in the legislation or the legal structure so that we cannot ascribe value, for example, to biodiversity or nature if it's not codified. And if it's not codified, then there's no liability. So until you can establish liability, it makes it difficult to have both carrots and sticks in your policy environment. So the policy institutional review takes care of that, gives us context for the country. Biodiversity expenditure review does the categorization and attribution of the budget that lets us know what we're currently spending and where it's going. And the financial needs assessment then does that orange box, tells us, okay, what's the NBSAP say? What are we spending? What do we need? How do we get those 2 things together? We put those 3 things together. Each of them points to some places where we need work. And we get a biodiversity finance plan, which is a prioritized list of finance solutions from the many mechanisms that we have categorized and described online, among which the countries might choose. So we use those finance solutions. We have 160, there are others out there to help facilitate countries' deliberations about how to go about bridging their biodiversity finance gap. Implementation, of course, comes next. Our workbook up there, you can see, does some of that work for us. So the process is something like this, where we do a scoping and then we identify the most promising finance solutions. Among them, you will recognize probably quite a few, but again, it's applied in a different context, and the context is always different country to country. We can learn things, right? We can stand on the shoulders of giants, but we can't always cookie cutter one solution to another place. So the BERs that we've done, the biodiversity expenditure reviews that we've done have revealed a lot of interesting information. You might remember that all OECD countries have promised to pledge 0.7% of GDP toward development. So we're curious, how much are our countries spending on biodiversity? And we came to a range of 0.1 to 0.2% of GDP, pretty solid range. There's some outliers. And 0.2 to 1.8% of national budget. National budget's probably the more accurate thing to be looking at because that's what we're talking about, them spending. But they are not so comparable across countries as it turns out, and they don't all report. So we use GDP because it resonates with everybody, even though that doesn't necessarily make sense. We can organize this information by what it's being spent on. So the Rio targets, which would be protection, restoration, sustainable use, and you can see Colombia's numbers there, or by jurisdiction. So national, regional, local. So environmental fiscal transfer is a tool that a lot of countries are using. So we need to know, is this central government? Is it regional government? Is it municipal government that's spending? This is Guatemala's. And we can also look at dependence on ODA, official development assistance, synergies with climate finance. And we also have these tagged against real markers, IET targets, and whatever the local targets are. This is the part you're interested in, so it took me a little while to get there. I'll do a quick review of some of the results that we've seen so far among the countries that are participating. We're increasingly looking at results-based budgeting, which you're probably quite familiar with, where instead of just getting a budget and saying, what should we do with it? You describe a result and back out what it is you need in order to get to that result. The KPIs, key performance indicators for biodiversity, are particularly challenging to get after and to measure, and then also to estimate what it is you're going to get and how much it's going to cost you. So results-based budgeting is being funded by AFD, the French Development Bank, in 10 of our countries. Green bonds, very popular. I think we were talking about them earlier this week. Most often are dealing with climate change and infrastructure for climate change, adaptation and mitigation. We're putting either biodiversity sidebars or mainstreaming into those sorts of proposals in order to make sure that we're at least doing no harm and hopefully getting co-benefits with the green bonds in a number of places. Often, or in several places, countries have established biodiversity finance units. The Seychelles and Belize, which Sarah may speak about, I'm not sure, have developed their own biodiversity finance office to manage all those trust funds and other things that might go through biodiversity unit. There's also Islamic finance in Indonesia, where we have green sukuk, which is essentially a bond. But because of it having to comply with Sharia law, we have to establish that biodiversity is a real tangible asset. That's the only way it works. And so that was a good trick that took a couple of years to get through the Indonesian government. Philippines are working with GCash, which I'll talk about in a sec, which is an app where you can pick, like a banking app, and they reward you for not using paper, but instead using electronics and by planting trees. Kind of neat. And in a number of countries, we have used crowdfunding in those that are highly tourism dependent during the COVID pandemic, because tourism went away and the parks and protected areas had no budget. So what do? We did 5 crowdfunding projects in Philippines, Thailand, Belize, Costa Rica. Is that 5? Maybe. And with a benefit of about $2 million so far. That helped then to fund anti-poaching, so park workers keep park families, people in proximal locations to the parks in business while we're waiting for international tourism to return. Conservation trust funds you guys talked about. So we have a number of situations where those are popular, particularly in Latin America. So here's Philippines. Out of BioFin came a new budget proposal of $25 million for a parks protected area system. They adopted new protected area regulations, and this GCash forest campaign was launched. In Costa Rica, just wanted to highlight that we have sort of a portfolio approach. When you diversify your portfolio in your investments, it's also good to diversify your portfolio in a project. So here we have institutionalization, a green bond, parks and protected area fees, payment for ecosystem services, and public and private partnerships in order to make sure that we're being successful on some of those fronts, if not all of those fronts. The institutionalization in Costa Rica is particularly interesting due to their status globally as a leader in environment. We had the former finance minister, not environment minister, finance minister, as the lead for BioFin in order to get the ears of those, not necessarily in the environmental sphere, but in the finance sphere. This is often a challenge. It's not an environmental project, it's a development project that takes nature into account. Let's see, payment for ecosystem services, theirs is of course quite well known since 1996. However, they're running into a cash crunch problem. Where does this come from? They're doing the right thing. They said we're going to be carbon neutral by 2030. What pays for their payment for ecosystem services? A gas tax. Uh-oh. Uh-oh. What are we going to do now? So they're trying to figure out how to do PES, not using this gas tax that they've been funding it by a sin tax essentially, in order to fund their PES system. Now that's not going to work any longer. Thankfully, Costa Rica being Costa Rica, they're thinking way ahead and they're going to get this sorted out somehow. Meanwhile, yeah, I'll get to that in a second. Sri Lanka also currently having their own issues, but back in 2019, we're being rather progressive in fully integrating and mainstreaming their biodiversity and green development into their programming and planning. What I heard as scuttlebutt this morning is that this might have been part of the problem. So this is one of those cautionary tales. The president at that time removed the subsidy to fertilizers. And when he did that, that made production of tea, and you're going fertilizer and tea? Yes. Tea and other export parts of the agricultural export industry go down. And when that happened, it contributed to collapse of the economy. That's at least the story I heard this morning. I have yet to be able to verify that. However, we also know they got hit by COVID like everybody else, and tourism was a very important part of that economy. And their debt became high risk, which made it much more difficult for them to get loans. So we have a sustainable tourism certification system there, green finance roadmap from 2019 through 2021, but then the economy collapsed. And now some of the folks are looking at debt for nature swaps for Sri Lanka, which is another thing that we want to be able to go into with our eyes wide open. It's debt, right? And so how do we manage debt? And is this a good idea for Sri Lanka? Still to be seen. You talked about offsets, usually in the terrestrial case. Often you don't hear about it so much in marine case. So in Fiji, they had a development go in, and when developments go in on the coast, they usually cut down the mangroves, right? So in Fiji, in order to put in beaches for well-heeled international tourists, mangroves are really important, obviously, for both fisheries and for carbon sequestration. And so what was done in this case is a 10-for-1 swap as an offset for this development to go in. The developer promised to protect 10 times as many hectares as they were disturbing for that development. However, that's great. However, it's not mandatory, it's voluntary. And so that's potentially problematic. And lots of things like these carbon markets that are carbon offsets are voluntary run afoul of the same problem. You get oversupply and not enough demand because it's not mandatory. So same issue here. And there are only 6 countries that have marine offset laws, making them mandatory. There are lots more that have terrestrial offset laws that make more sense. Offsets in general, though, I think we want to make sure we're careful about those, in part because if the expenditure on offset goes up, what does that tell you? It tells you we've damaged more protected, more important areas. So if mitigation hierarchy is working well, makes perfect sense. If it isn't, we want to be careful. And we want to make sure we're getting like for like. And we want to make sure all those things are coming through that we need in order to make sure that we're actually resulting in biodiversity or nature positive investments due to the offset. Now, clearly we're not doing this by ourselves. We have lots of collaborators and there are lots of people doing things without us, which is wonderful. So the types of things that are going on include this alphabet soup here. So TNFD, Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosure. I'm not sure if that came up yet this week. Started about a year ago on the heels of the TCFD, Climate Financial Disclosure, private sector orientation toward accounting for your company's effect on the environment. It will, those things will usually take a risk perspective, mitigate different types of risk in the private sector. And so there are 3 of those at least. Jeff 7 and Jeff 8, the global environmental facilities, billions of dollars of money toward environmental investments. Jeff 7 released $250,000 for 100 countries to do a biodiversity finance plan in the next year through 2023. Jeff 8 will have a provision for biodiversity finance plan. We're the only people who do that. So that's why I said we're going to go to 100 countries pretty darn quick. Natural capital accounting is the valuation side of the budget. So SEA, System of Environmental Economic Accounts, tells us what the stuff is worth, whereas BioFin is telling us how much we're going to invest in it to maintain what that's worth. We also work with a bunch of other initiatives through United Nations and others, and through NGOs, and through a number of platforms. The last one is the one with Prince Charles and the accounting for sustainability. And so I just wanted to drop my picture in there. So that's why I've got that up there. All right, that's everything, I think. Oh, I need to use this. Thank you so much. And I look forward to the discussion.
As we're shifting slides, Andy's contact information here. As we're shifting slides, do we have a quick question or two for Andy?
I'm here.
Yes.
Is there any form of international conservation finance that's relatively robust to the challenges of governance and security in some of the high biodiversity tropical areas? I would guess that the investment is somewhat disproportional to more secure places.
Yeah, you can see it in lending rates, right? So the lending rates taken into account risk and expected returns. So in most developing nations, you're going to see, micro lending at 35% or so, and banks are going to be more, 15, 16. Whereas the same investment, same return, you'd expect 5% these days, or something like that in a more stable economy. Sometimes you can, it depends on the type of instability. Is it corruption? Is it government changes of government? So like some of the governments I work with, there won't be an environmental ministry next year because like that's what happened in Brazil. They said, oh no, we don't need that. It's under economy now. So that kind of instability is difficult. Sometimes working through international NGOs can create some stability and some accountability. But still, if there's going to be a revolution, that's a problem. But yeah, I don't have a quick, easy answer for you. But yeah, what do you think? That's my professor answer.
Yeah, I'm not sure, but I think you're right. Different times, we probably lend different tools.
Yeah.
I would just say from TNC's perspective too, one of the ways that we de-risk some things is by bringing in other partners and the more partners that are involved. And so if it's, whether it's bringing in Jeff or bringing in, whoever else, that also helps to us feel more comfortable with taking on some more of those risks as well. It depends on the risk. You're good?
All right, I think so, because we're sharing the slides
Yeah, that works.
here. It's going to be like this.
Okay.
But you can also see yourself here over there or look to
Okay.
Julie over here.
We figured it out, so we don't need to do this. We're good.
You got it.
Well, hi everyone. It's great to meet you all. My name is Sarah Mascola, and I work for the Nature Conservancy. I'm on our global protection team, and I'm really excited to be here today. And it's actually perfect that we're following Andy's presentation because he was talking really broadly about this biodiversity financing gap, and Julie and I are going to talk about a specific example we were trying to close that gap a little bit. And when we were first talking about this presentation, Jackson and Lee were telling me, we're looking for some really tangible examples of like where this has been applied on the ground, and so they're kind of throwing out all these different kinds of mechanisms. And I was listening to all these places, but everything kind of touched down in Belize. And so we said, rather than share a bunch of case studies from a different place, we're going to use Belize as a deep dive. We're going to have Julie Robinson, who is the Nature Conservancy's country program director in Belize, tell her perspective on how all these different tools worked and how sometimes they can actually start to stack them together to have bigger outcomes and do a better job at closing that biodiversity gap. So I am going to hand it over to Julie to kick us off and talk through some of the mechanisms. And then one of the things that Jackson Lee said, okay, well, that's great. It worked in Belize. Can it work other places? So I'm just going to talk through, what does this look like in other places? Some of the tools that we're talking about, and actually get to the question about like, what are the enabling conditions we start to look at in these types of projects that make them feasible or not? So Julie, I hand over to you and you can introduce yourself quickly.
Okay, great. Thanks, Sarah. Can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
Great. Okay, so Julie Robinson, I'm the program director for Belize. I'm based in Belmopan, capital city, probably the smallest capital in the world. But I kind of want to start off by telling you a little bit about, why is conservation financing important, and more specifically, kind of why Belize. So can you jump to the next slide? Great, thank you. So in terms of why Belize, and I was listening to Andy about, surveying the world. Well, when you survey the world, I want to say that Belize actually really does matter to the world. We are a biodiversity hotspot. We're ranked third among small countries that pack a huge biodiversity punch into small territories. But we're also, it's not just about biodiversity, but it's also about people. It once harbored ancient Mayan civilizations, and with hundreds of Mayan sites dotted all over the country. What you see today is a country that is multicultural, multilingual, and it reflects a really rich history of this culture that is fully integrated into the biodiversity and into nature. As Belizeans, we refer to Belize as the jewel because it is so rich. But also it's, this is a little bit, we've actually got more than 40% of our land mass currently protected and 23% of our waters that is protected. Small population of just over 400,000 people, but we also have the second longest barrier reef in the world, second only to the Australia's Great Barrier Reef. And spanning across the country of Belize and northern Guatemala and southern Mexico is the Selva Maya, which is the second largest tropical forest in all of the Americas. So there's a lot happening in Belize. So if we want to go to the next slide, what I want to do briefly is talk about some of the different financial mechanisms that we're currently either implementing or have implemented or are piloting. And the first one really is about blue carbon. Now we heard Andy talk about carbon offsets. So here's where it touches on the ground. just to mention, this is very much a pilot for us. It's the Blue Carbon Project, where we're focused on a specific atoll. This is where we're looking at a blended finance approach, where we're bringing in philanthropic dollars, government allocation, and private investments to help to cover the costs for the development of a blue carbon project. So it's currently in the development phase. The country is developing its carbon policy. So some of this is still theoretical. So for example, what we're saying is that right now the credits would be donated by private landowners. So this is a partnership with the landowners to help to incentivize them, financially incentivize them to not clear mangroves. So it's a partnership with them, and they would donate the credits or donate donate the rights, the rights to the carbon credits to the Nature Conservancy for development, perfection, and marketing. The proceeds from the sale, once it is developed, the proceeds from those sales would then go towards the establishment of a $2.4 million endowment that would then provide funding to the Turner Federal Sustainability Association for management and monitoring. A portion of that also goes towards covering the cost of the carbon development, and a portion would also go to the private landowner and the government of Belize. So that benefit sharing agreement is what we're currently talking about that would be incorporated into the policy. Next slide. The next one I want to talk about is the blue bonds. So in this particular case, the Belize blue bonds was recently closed this deal in November of last year. It is the largest debt restructure for marine conservation that the world has ever seen. So what it is restructuring sovereign debt for marine conservation. In this case, what we did was we restructured over $550 million of Belize's commercial debt, which is called a super bond. We provided the financing to the government through a $364 million loan that was being financed through Credit Suisse to purchase the debt at a 45% discount, or as you can see here, 55 cents on the dollar. This created an immediate principal reduction of $189 million. We were able to provide a new interest rate of 6.1 million, which 6.1%, not 6.1 million, which if the country went to try and do this through a bank, they would have gotten somewhere between 16 to 18%. What also happens is that the savings that are coming from this debt reduction then goes towards conservation. So that equates to an average of 4.2 million over a 20-year period, as well as the establishment of a $23.5 million endowment that we estimate will grow to 92 million by 2041, which is the length of the loan. In terms of the conservation benefits of this, the government committed to protecting 30% of its entire ocean by 2026. And half of that is going to be within high biodiversity protection, or what we would call no-take or a non-extractive. They also committed to conducting a science-based participatory marine spatial plan that will then be used to design both the protected areas as well as just as uses within the ocean space. And then finally, the establishment of a conservation fund, which is the Belize Fund for Sustainable Future. And this fund will be, is the vehicle that will distribute that $4.2 million for conservation to partner to NGOs, to private sector, as well as the government agencies who will be implementing this work. I'm not going to get into the schematics on the right, but that's just, it was really through two major agreements. One was a blue loan agreement that was done between Credit Suisse, the Nature Conservancy, our subsidiary, and the government of Belize, as well as the actual bondholders. And then a second agreement was a conservation funding agreement, which is what is held, guiding the cash flows for conservation and the delivery of those conservation commitments that the government made. Next slide. So another really innovative mechanism, and this one is around carbon offsetting as well, was for the Belize Bioforest. So the Belize Bioforest it's 236,000 acres of forested land that was an immediate threat of being deforested for agriculture. What we were able to do was to purchase the property, which was the actual purchase price was $76.5 million, but the total project cost was $98 million. However, what we're able to do is through the development of the carbon project, which is estimated anywhere between 10 to 14 million tons of carbon that would be sequestered on this property, we're able to take the proceeds from that to do several things. One is to first establish a $15 million endowment fund that will be used to ensure management in perpetuity of the property. Secondly, is to pay back a portion of the acquisition cost. So up to half of the acquisition cost will be paid for using carbon offsets. And all the other proceeds above and beyond that would then be redirected by the local trust that is managing the property and the government of Belize. It is our expectation that those additional funds would go back into management of the property itself and as well as engagement in the surrounding communities. Next slide. So another very innovative pilot project is really one around parametric insurance. And this is using developing a parametric product using microfinancing that really empowers individuals and people to collectively insure an entire habitat. This is work that we're just about to kick off. We haven't had the final green light from our partners as yet, so there's only so much information I can share. However, we expect within the next couple of weeks, we'll be launching this. What it is we'll be working with an insurance company who, through their customer base, will be donating towards this parametric insurance. We expect that we'll have roughly an annual premium of around $150,000 with payouts between $400,000 to $1 million, of course, depending on the severity of the trigger. The triggers would be either storms, which Belize being in the Caribbean are very much, unfortunately, susceptible to, but also fires and wildfires. And so if there's an event, if there is a trigger of either a storm or fire or both, then it would trigger these payouts. As you can see over on for how the use of the money would be used, a portion of that unpaid claims would go towards contributing towards any risk mitigation. So reducing fire risk through improving agricultural practices, for example, training with communities and rangers on fire management and forest restoration. Some of those funds are also available for any post-event response, any restoration or capacity that would be needed following any storms or wildfires. And any additional revenues will then be directed towards buffer community projects. Next slide.
Okay, so I think that's over to me for some quick points. But one thing I just wanted to mention, talked about the stacking of some of these tools. So Julie talked about in the Belize Bioforest, the only reason we were actually able to do that acquisition and going into it was knowing that we'd be able to set up that carbon offset project. And so that was critical too, to get that up front in the part of the plan, because that was what documented the additionality. It's not that TNC could already protect it and then afterwards we put a carbon project on, but that was in the plan because of the cost of that property and all of the funding that we needed. And even after we've done that carbon project, looking at this new innovative kind of financing mechanism to help pay for additional work in the surrounding buffer communities to help mitigate some of those external threats that are happening with properties. And Julie and I know last year, it's like the day, I think right when we closed, it was like the next week, there was a fire on the southern edge. We didn't have all our systems in place. We had to figure out how we're going to fight that. So there's lots of risks that kind of come in, and that mechanism was helping to really make sure that this property is actually protected, it's effectively managed, it's durable, and that those surrounding communities have really good practices as well. So similarly, we're going to talk about this kind of newer tool that we're working on with partners. This is actually a project that's led by WWF, but the Nature Conservancy, WWF, Pew Charitable Trust and Zoma Lab have formed a partnership called Enduring Earth. And it's looking at this tool called a project finance for permanence, which really takes kind of private financing approach to conservation. And they basically said, like, conservationists, what you guys do is you kind of go after your plan and you're constantly underfunding work, and then you have to raise more money or you have to figure out these other mechanisms. And they're trying to apply more principles from the private sector to conservation financing. And so it really looks at how do you bring together all of the stakeholders, you set really clear conservation commitments and plans and targets, and you think about what is that overall total financing that you need to get to a perpetually sustaining financing mechanism. And all those things have to come together before the project officially kind of closes. And so it means you're building the momentum, you're doing all the planning and you're getting all those commitments, but nobody actually is held accountable to that until everything is all locked up and then you all sign at that single close. So from a donor perspective, they really like this because they're able to say, like, okay, I don't have any risk until I know that all these other pieces are complete. And so you're able to really unlock a lot more financing, both from private and public financing sources to do that. In Belize, WWF is leading a PFP, and what they've estimated is that over the next 10 years, they need to secure $120 million for that sinking fund to get to the point where then there would be $7 million a year generated that would ensure that you have durable financing for all of those conservation commitments, which includes expanding protected area systems, improving the management and the effectiveness of those systems, supporting livelihoods. So there's funding in this that would go towards starting and supporting micro businesses and other types of sustainable economic development, especially around the blue economy, and has a series of climate mitigation benefits, and also includes funding for management and improving governance and some of those systems. So the goal is that these projects take many years. You do a lot of the planning on the front end. So they take on average between 5 to 7 years. We're hoping by working as partners, we'll be able to do more of them and we'll do them faster. But in Belize in particular, what they're going to be doing is working on this with all the government, and that blue bond that Julie talked about is going to feed in as one of the primary funding sources for this as well. And so again, you can start to see how you can keep continuing to build on these tools in one place and have a much bigger impact and really start to close that financing gap that Andy was talking about. So one of the things, I know we're kind of at time here, but just very quickly, I think it was really important. Belize is a very small country. I think I was shocked when the first time I realized how the actual size of it, some of the projects that we've done, account for almost 5% of the landmass at certain times. And so it kind of gives you a whole different perspective about being able to accomplish some of this work. But all the tools that Julie talked about are definitely feasible in other places. And so I just wanted to say, from just as tangible examples for the Nature Conservancy, we do have replication of all these types of projects around the world. And I'll show you guys just a few maps of some of the places that we're looking at. But the other thing that's really important is just as a conservation community, looking at how you improve some of those enabling conditions and systems. And so to the question around some of the risk mitigation and where and when you might want to engage in some of these things, there's a lot of initiatives out there to look at how you might be able to do that and de-risk some of these conservation investments. One of the things that I just wanted to flag that we've been looking at as an example is within the carbon markets, kind of looking at raising the bar and improving some of those standards and how verifications take place to make sure you're really getting that additionality in carbon projects. But just very briefly, so this is just a map to show you where some of the Conservancy carbon, natural climate solutions projects are. Some of these have carbon projects on it, but that blue carbon model that Julie was talking about is a relatively new tool for us. We're also stacking it with a resiliency credit, which she didn't get into, but adds another level of kind of a financial mechanism. And we've got projects in New Zealand and in Mexico and Indonesia and Belize that we're scoping out, as well as in the US. Similarly with forest carbon, we have multiple projects all over the world. For those blue bonds, that debt restructuring, these are extremely complex and difficult projects that are only feasible in places where debt is trading at a certain value. And so we've completed 2 in the marine context in the Seychelles and Belize. We are scoping out additional projects that are in Africa and primarily in Central and South America. And here, this is really critical where those enabling conditions have to be in place. And so really making sure that there's a stable government who will be able to implement and proceed with those kinds of commitments that they're making, ensuring that you have the right kind of financial feasibility so that, again, what the debt is trading at, interest, And here's a place where Andy was talking about our primary partners in doing these kinds of deals is often the Ministry of Finance. We also work with the Ministry of Environment, or in the case of Belize, it was the Ministry of Blue Economy. But it's really the ministries that have a lot of influence and a lot of power within those governments. And they see this as a development deal that has conservation benefits. And so it's really important for us that we're going in with really clear understanding of what our minimum expectations and commitments are from the conservation perspective. And then finally, I just wanted to flag for this project finance for permanence. I mentioned we have this partnership. In the last 20 years, we've done 5 of these types of deals. And we are hoping that by leveraging our partnerships and really working together and supporting each other's transactions and deals, that we'll be able to do 20 of these in the next 10 years. And so you can see the countries that have light green are places where we have done PFPs, and then all the other colors mark different PFPs that are in various stages. But this is just one key point I want to make, is that no individual institution or government or organization can do any of these types of big complex deals alone. And so the more partners that we have involved, it helps to spread some of that risk, but you're also able to leverage different resources and strengths of different organizations and institutions. So our final slide is Julie's going to just share a little bit about how this work, again, going back to Belize, has really impacted them at a national level.
Yeah, no, just quickly, because I know we're at time, but this is not easy. It is complicated, it is hard, but it is so worth it. We're using innovative financing mechanisms, to not only save our forests and reefs, but really our people as well. When I think about my forest, it provides clean drinking water for like a third of Belizeans and a quarter of our farmers. And in restructuring the super bond and the blue bonds deal, we reduced our debt to GDP ratio by 12%. It really and truly saved us from an economic crisis. So piloting new groundbreaking schemes, we're doing this here in Belize, and it's really allowing us to scale up across the world. And so, yeah, it really does matter. And it doesn't matter how small it is or how small a country is. The impact of our work here will really be felt, for generations to come.
Thanks, Julie.
Well, we definitely have a couple direct questions, and then maybe we'll invite Andy back for the conversation too.
Oh yeah. Can I make Julie bigger? Yeah, I'll stop sharing.
I think we stop
You
the.
don't need to make me bigger. I'm good.
Oh yeah, Julie. We're gonna do full screen.
Oh,
Yeah. Woo.
Questions for Julie, for Sarah, for Andy? Brad.
So you mentioned the carbon project, and I know that in the tropics, there's a lot of questions about project-based carbon or jurisdictional-based carbon, and double counting and all that sort of stuff. How are you all navigating that?
Yeah, that's a tough one. And maybe, Julie, this actually is an interesting issue that's come up in Belize, because while we were negotiating with the government, our carbon rights to do this very specific project, which is significant, it's 5% of the landmass of Belize, they were also thinking about their jurisdictional approach. And it was happening at the same time that we're negotiating this after we'd already committed to acquiring the property. So that was a pretty challenging time for us to make sure we knew what was going on. But Julie, do you want to talk about how they're approaching it in Belize and how we're...
Yeah, sure. We're actually literally having these discussions right now. We're talking to the Climate Change Office and Ministry of Finance, and we're trying to see how do we account for differences, because what the country is reporting as part of their, as part of their FREL, and our contribution to the NDCs doesn't really align with what we are, what we're coming up with in terms of a single property. So we don't have the answer yet. We are talking to the government to see how we can consolidate and be consistent in the reporting. So that's something that we are actively working on right now.
Double counting or?
Yeah, the government's also proposing in Belize to issue carbon credits within the protected areas.
Can you speak up just a little?
Yes. The Belizean government's also considering a program to issue carbon credits from within their protected areas. And here again, we have the additionality issue, clearly. But their thought is that by maintaining that this is a way to issue those credits and then support offsetting of development. You can see that that's a big kettle of fish right there. So double counting would also be an issue. Yeah.
Hi, I've got a question for Andy. Refer you back to the slides with the green bonds in Zambia. I have been in presentations about green bonds in Africa, and one of the criticism about that was that there has been very little accountability for biodiversity value that those bonds hold. And I'm curious whether, I mean, you haven't picked up, you shake your head, which means you picked up on that criticism. So I'm wondering how you're structuring that into the bond in Zambia, what you have, because you mentioned some biodiversity aspects in the bonds in Africa.
Yeah, it's a great question. And so Zambia has actually put out a tender just this morning for 3 consultants to work on that and to make sure that the biodiversity is mainstreamed into those into their green bond issue and into the projects then that that subsequently are implemented with those monies. So it's not only, so it's both sides, right? And yeah, and it's clearly a concern or all the bonds, right? There's bonds with all the different names in the fronts of them now. There's nature performance bonds, the rhino bond, the right, all of these. And first of all, they're all debt issues. And secondly, they tend to work on the climate mitigation adaptation side. And they say, well, there are co-benefits for biodiversity. Okay, let's measure them, right? So the KPIs are super important on the biodiversity side. It's easier to count carbon and see if it's still there. It's harder to do it the other way. What often happens is we get a climate project that claims to have biodiversity co-benefits as opposed to the other way around. Biodiversity project that has climate co-benefits. Sometimes we're not communicating real well, and sometimes we will see where there are trade-offs between the two. So if you plant eucalyptus as an invasive species, great for carbon, really bad for biodiversity, right? We need to count both, otherwise we're going to make big mistakes. So great question. I don't have a good, oh yeah, we got that sorted, no problem.
Work in progress.
Yeah.
Just want to thank Julie for adding a presenter to the session.
Yes, there's only one right now. She's got like a couple of them. Your dog. He knew we were talking about him. Yeah.
This is Jackson. This is
Yeah.
Jackson from the Conservation Finance Network. If somebody's interested in a PFP, project finance for permanence, should they get in touch with Michael Pressman, or who's the right person to put in touch with?
Yeah, I can direct people for that. I think the cool thing about the project finance for permanence work is that we're really working with our partners as kind of a cohort of teams. And so depending on the country where you're looking at that, there might be a different partner that's responsible, and we're all leaning in. So for example, like the Nature Conservancy would donate to and contribute to both resources and staff time to other country programs, but I'll be the best point of contact for that for first. And I'll just say those PFPs are super complicated and complex. The first few that we did were kind of in the tens of millions, but now when we're doing some of that full cost budgeting, it's really in the hundreds of millions. And you can do it at different scales. Primarily, they've been at the national scale, but there are ways to do it at a smaller regional scale.
How PNC is the lead for that for nature's bonds, or the bonds with the super bonds?
What's our role in that, or?
Yeah, or how do you guys are leading that, and how that gets structured, because it's really
Very complicated, yes. And so this is not my full area of expertise, and Julie can talk about it a little bit more in the Belize context, but within the Nature Conservancy, we do have a specialized group that we call Nature Vest who look at these financial transactions and work really closely with the finance ministers on it. But it's all through partnerships. So we mentioned that we work with different kind of Credit Suisse and others. We also have to get a risk insurance on this, to somebody else's question on this, because it's a very complicated thing for us to take on that liability as an institution and as an organization. But yeah, what really goes in is we do that first initial scoping and viability. We work really closely with the government, understand if it's feasible, if they're interested, what kind of conservation commitments we could see, what does the debt restructure actually look like, how much is feasible, how much funding would that derive for conservation, and what are the other benefits associated with that. And it's all a long negotiation. And again, this is a mechanism that's only feasible in some places where the debt kind of financials work out and where those other enabling conditions are also there. So political stability and support and buy-in are key. And then we go through that negotiation process with all those other partners and pull that all together. And when we get to the close, that's actually when all the conservation work starts. Then we do those spatial planning exercises, lots of consultation and stakeholder engagement. And then there's mechanisms within those kinds of debt swaps, or in the case of marine context, the blue bond, that those payouts only happen when certain commitments are met. So there's kind of these fail safes in there to make sure that the work is actually happening to generate those payouts.
If I could add maybe a little bit more to that, Sarah, in terms of the role that TNC plays, really, we are de-risking this. That's a big part of this. So through those strong partnerships for us, we're able to bring in, for example, in the case of Belize, the United States Development Finance Corporation, which provided that political risk insurance. Without that, we wouldn't be, so before closing this deal, this bond was essentially rated at a C+, and after it was a AA rating. That could only happen because of the de-risking that happened, and that would not happen if TNC were not at the table. And that was what enabled Credit Suisse to provide the financing as well. So that's one of the major roles that we're playing in all of these deals throughout the world.
Question for you, Julie. Taking back to the PFPs, do those include private protected areas, or is it only protected areas? And that's just because there's a bigger chunk of private protected areas, particular places like Africa, which complement or should or would be a better complement for the protected area.
Yeah. Joy, I don't know if you know within Belize if the PFP would include private protected areas as well. I can speak to some examples in Africa. Yeah.
Yeah, for the case of Belize, it's different because this particular PFP is looking only at marine and coastal areas. So there are no private protected areas within marine and coastal. It's all public.
Yeah. But I would say as a mechanism, it is feasible. And so just an example, we're working on a PFP in Kenya where it's all through conservancies. And so that model is about expanding all of the Conservancy models to help with the 30 by 30 target in line with CBD, if that happens hopefully in December. So there are different models. And you know, with all these tools, as Andy mentioned, all of them are tailored really to the local context and really what those needs and opportunities are. And we use a wide variety of protection mechanisms, all IUCN categories, OECMs also that can be included in there.
Maybe time for one more question. Peter.
I don't want to put the panelists on the spot, but it's actually a question for all of you, because I found this fascinating. And I really want you all to take T. Thomas's presentation from Tuesday and meld it into this, because some of the elements, particularly the blue bond debt restructuring in Belize, is exactly what can happen with the new SRF stuff in the US.
No more questions? I guess we said last one.
Yeah.
All right.
I know we keep going back to carbon, but I'm working with large NGOs who are still struggling about like to what extent they engage in the carbon market. And I'm very interested that TNC have sort of gone for it. Why, how did you manage to kind of get comfortable with it? What do you see as best practice around engaging? And then you're talking about benefit sharing agreements. So it's quite, how are you kind of seeing the design of that to make sure that it's credible? And
yeah. Well, first I'll say, I mean, TNC is a really large organization and there's been a lot of dialogue, and I think our appetite and risk to engage in the carbon market fluctuates over time. This project that we talked about, the Blaze Mile Forest, I think is the largest carbon project we've ever done, right, Julie? You know?
It is the largest, but also to mention that Belize is also where the very first carbon project for TNC was ever done. And that was, back in, we completed that in 2012.
Yeah. So there, I mean, we have had a lot of internal dialogue over it. And I think a lot of retrospective looking back at like, how do we engage with the carbon offset market? And actually my background's in mitigation and biodiversity offsets, and kind of to Andy's point too about offsets and what does that mean? And so there is a big kind of question around that. Recently, and I mentioned this kind of in the conversation, I think that we have taken a step back and we said that, yes, we are engaging in the carbon markets. But one of the things that we feel is really important is to, especially as a voluntary market, increase the standards that you're starting to see in there and make sure that things like leakage and additionality and all those things are actually properly addressed. And that we do a lot more projects that have climate mitigation benefits that are not offset projects as well. So it's a little bit of a mixed bag. As far as an organization, we have people who are specialized in this that we've decided to build up and invest in that to help our ability to really do this in a way that we agree with. But it has been an active and ongoing conversation. And I would say over time, it kind of tends to fluctuate a little bit in terms of our comfort with the market.
I tried to cover the actual globe in about an hour. It's completely not doing justice to the great work that's being done internationally and a lot of innovation that's occurring, but we wanted to give you perhaps we're at the mall and we're getting the little bite of the Auntie Anne's pretzel today in the hopes that you have a couple of new colleagues to connect with and dig a little further, especially where that aligns with some of your work and interests. So please join me in thanking Julie, Sarah. Julie, I hope you have a nice little snuggle session after this. That was nice.
Yeah. Always, these dogs, they're snugglers. And you can always tell what time of the day it is. It's like at 4 o'clock, those dogs are all in her office ready for their walks.
All right.
That's great. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Julie. All right, so we're gonna end the recording, Katie. Yeah, do that there. Okay, there's a cursor. Start recording.